I have wept and I have fallen. Don't you worry about me. 'Cause I stood up, yes, I have grown. The pain has set me free. And like a broken record in my head.
Welcome back to Conscious Fever, hosted by Carl Price.
It's the best of the best. It's the one and only.
You can't handle the truth.
I ain't scared of you motherfuckers.
Either way, I don't give a damn what you think you are entitled to.
You are listening to Conscious Fever, hosted by Carl Price.
Ooh, he pushed the button, didn't he? He pushed the button. Punched the LGBTQ community right in the AIDS.
Ladies and gentlemen, the moment you've been waiting for. So listen responsibly.
Hey, good evening. Welcome to Conscious Fever here on ICE Entertainment Television and Conscious Fever Radio. I am Carl Price, your host, here in Echoes. So I have to do some things. Thanks for joining me tonight. It's Thursday night, Louisville, Kentucky. It's rainy. If this was Georgia, it'd be a rainy night in Georgia. Hey, welcome to the show. I'm Carl Price. I'm hosting Conscious Fever tonight here on ICE Entertainment Television and Conscious Fever Radio. And I'm going to try to do this in a most comfortable way. So that means I'm going to have to unloosen one of my buttons on my shirt. But listen, tonight I am talking about race norming. I don't know if y'all have heard of race norming, but it's an interesting topic to learn about. So we're going to talk about that tonight because the connection with race norming is really it's just a concept that connects the NFL and medicine and how it is applied to Black America together, right? This whole idea of race norming. So if you've ever been to the doctor and tried to explain to the doctor that you were in pain and the doctor refused to give you pain medication, this may be the reason why. So you may want to listen to this tonight. Just a little conscious stuff here on Conscious Fever. In my practice as a lawyer, or when I practice injury cases, sometimes I have doctors that tells me that some of my clients are just there to get pills. And then I have to discontinue my association with that doctor because there's this saying that there's a lot of doctors mostly white doctors, mostly Indian doctors, that don't really understand the pain levels of Black America or Black folks, because for all these years, many of y'all may not have known, it's because of race norming. So we're going to talk about that, and if you're associated with the NFL in any way, then you know what I'm talking about. So there's some things that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what happened in June of this year with the NFL, with most of their personnel, actually the majority, about 75% of the personnel that's making the NFL owners and the association money are African American or Black men. And as a result thereof, they were still employing some racist policies. So that's something that we're going to talk about tonight. I'm gonna really try to dive into this. So I don't want you to go too far. I'm going to take a little breather. Take a deep breath. I got somebody just as a guest just watching in the studio tonight, and they don't really, have any conversation at all with the audience. We've got an audience here, and I'm going to have the audience to say hello to you, just kind of, greet you. Okay. He don't want to be he doesn't want to be greeted, so we probably just have to cut that out. So in any case, but listen, I'm going to dive right into this. We're going to talk about race norming tonight and the connection between the NFL, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how doctors are taught to treat, believe it or not, Black folks. And I'm going to explain to you what race norming is. So if you didn't know this is probably something that consciously you're going to receive tonight. I'm Carl Price. This is Conscious Fever. I'll be right back, so don't go anywhere. This is going to be real quick.
This time to run it on. No sleep, no rest. Might crash, might wreck. But first I time to run it on. 9 out of 10 roll through my hands, I'm by my lonely. Turned to a savage, now my baby wants to hold me. I love my fans, don't need no friends, I got my homies. Thought I could trust you, I find out you tried to zone me. I'm number 1 up on that court, I'm Nick McGrady. The first one in, the last one out, can't call me lazy. Put in my hours, send the invoice, and they pay me.
All right, hey, welcome back to Conscious Fever here on Ice Entertainment Television, Conscious Fever Radio. I am Carl Price, your host. Listen, some of y'all may not know this, but on June 2nd of this year, the NFL, a National Football League, we know it as the NFL, announced that it would discontinue the use of race norming, the practice of assuming a lower baseline of cognitive abilities in Black players. And the NFL agreed that it would stop using this race norming stuff. This came out in illegal settlements for concussions and concussion-related injuries. So for the past several years, many of you may have known this, you may not have known this, but Black former professional football players, led by a former Pittsburgh Steelers by the name of Kevin Henry and Najee Davenport, had been speaking out against the practice of race norming. Now, Henry and Davenport and colleagues demonstrated that race norming was interfering with their ability to receive compensation and benefits from the settlement. And this was a huge settlement, almost $1 billion. But the Black retirees, who are overrepresented in the number of former players, stacked legitimate claims about, put out there legitimate claims about their impaired health after rising or risking their minds and bodies for this American sport. But the bottom line, the race norming practice limited Black players access to the compensation that they were rightfully owed. Okay, so I'm going to pause here just a second. I'm going to talk to you about race norming. And before I really get into that, I am going to tell you that, this is something that was on this website, Scientific. The website is this website that it just talks about scientific information. And the name of the article is Race Norming and the Long Legacy of Medical Racism. And these authors do a pretty good job of explaining it. The NFL recently announced that it would end the practice, but race norming is still used across the medical field in this country that we call America. So let's talk about what race normating is, right? It is really like, and this is according to one of the doctors, it's really likely that the average person of African ancestry is cognitively impaired when compared to the average white person, right? And that's a question that David Jones, who is a Harvard historian and medical ethicist, told Vox.com. He said, I can't think of how that could actually be true. And that was the question that was just posed. And the assumption that it is true just sounds like white supremacist racism to him, he said. He said, we need to subject any claims like this to really strict scrutiny. Now, the discussion about race-based practices in medicine is fraught. While medical communities largely no longer believe that race is rooted in biological differences, rather race is a social construct. Remnants of this outdated belief remain in institutionalized clinical practices. Legitimizing racial differences through medical tools and policies is still dangerous, according to a growing community of doctors and scholars, and sustains the bias and unequal care that Black patients and other patients of color have received for centuries. How race normating is used in medicine, right? So here we go. Race normating, it's also called race correction, ethnic adjustment, or race adjustment. And all of these terms and these phrases have been integrated into medical tools, from kidney stone risk calculators to oncology risk assessment tools, right? Since at least as early as the 1990s. David Jones and his co-authors provided that information to Vox.com. Race is usually just one factor used to determine a person's risk or illness or disease in these tools. Factors like sex assigned at birth, severity of the pains, and age are often also part of the algorithms. But last year, Jones and residents Darshali and Leo Eisenstein identified a partial list of 13 tools across a variety of medical specialties: cardiology, nephrology, obstetrics, urology, oncology, endocrinology, and pulmonology that used race correction. Now, keep in mind what we're talking about here, right? Race correction is this ideal of race normating. And in their research, they concluded that race correction perpetuates race-based inequity as it relies on stereotypes about people of color, often Black people, and can prevent these patients from receiving adequate care. By embedding race into the basic data and decisions of healthcare, these algorithms propagate race-based medicine in ways that may direct more attention or resources to white patients than to members of racial and ethnic minorities. And they wrote that in the study. For example, the Stone score, STONE score, helps doctors determine the likelihood of kidney stones in a patient who shows up to the emergency room with flank pain, right? And so the doctors enter 5 variables into this digital calculator: sex, duration of pain, whether the patient is experiencing nausea or vomiting, whether there's blood in their urine, and race and origin, right? To predict whether a patient has kidney stones. If a doctor identifies a patient as non-Black, the calculator will add 3 points out of a possible 13 points total. The patients who receive a high score, 10 to 13, for example, on the scale, have a 90% probability of kidney stones, according to the calculator, right? Now, after testing the calculator, this calculator with 491 randomly selected patients, its creator concluded in a 2014 study that the score reliably predicts the presence of kidney stones. But in his research, he did not explain why race is incorporated as an element of the calculator. And assigning a lower score to Black patients could influence practitioners to avoid a thorough, quote, thorough evaluation for kidney stones in Black patients. Now, Other examples, for instance, there's just so many examples, right, for measuring kidney stone, for measuring kidney functions. Doctors estimated patients' filtration rate, or EGFR. Now that's important. I want y'all to remember that. EGFR is EGFR to determine how much blood passes through filters in the kidneys. The equation is based on research from a 1999 paper that suggested that black people have better kidney function than white people because black people are supposedly more muscular, a notion that isn't evidence-based and was used to justify slavery. And the EGFR has had an impact on the treatment of black kidney patients. In a recent article for Slate, emergency medicine physician Jennifer Tsai described the case of Jordan Crowley. Now check this out, y'all. Jordan Crowley is a biracial patient with one black grandparent and 3 white ones, who will be in line for a kidney if his doctors identified him as white in the EGFR equation. Because his doctors identifies him as black, Crowley is waiting for his kidney function to decline even more so that he can be placed on the transplant list. Now, Tsai explained how a non-racially adjusted kidney function estimate could help black patients get registered on the kidney transplant waiting list, reversing the grave statistic that 9 of the 15 people who die every day waiting are black. If race correction weren't used in the EGFR, an October 2020 study found close to a third of black patients who would have been reclassified as having a more severe kidney condition, prompting advanced care, right? Then there is a tool called the vaginal birth after cesarean. And y'all know about this, right? The acronym for it is VBAC, right? It's a calculator. You know, they use this VBAC calculator. Now, for 14 years, many in the medical field use the VBAC calculator to predict the amount of risk a person would, or woman would have with the vaginal birth after having a C-section in their previous pregnancies. The algorithm predicts higher risk for anyone who identifies as black or Hispanic, yet the study used to develop the VBAC calculator also found that marital status and insurance type were correlates for VBAC success, but those factors were not included in the algorithm. The calculator, according to Bias, noted, could unnecessarily and disproportionately steer black and Hispanic women away from a vaginal birth, which is usually less risky than a C-section. Now, this dynamic is particularly troubling because black people already have a higher rates of maternal mortality. Now, Bias and her co-authors wrote in this article, after advocacy from Bias and others in the field, race correction was removed from the calculator just a few months ago, right? So, you know, this is interesting stuff as we talk about this, and I want to make sure that we give the due credit to the people that actually wrote this article. But let me get back to the NFL, because we were talking about the NFL, and I want to make sure that we keep this thing as focused as we can on this whole idea of what the what happened and what's really happening in the NFL. And if you believe that race normating is particularly gone, you probably want to think again. In 2013, the NFL settled for $765 million after more than 4,500 retired players brought concussion-related lawsuits against the league. In theory, approximately 18,000 former players were eligible to receive the settlement, which is meant to cover, by the way, compensation, medical exams, further research, and legal fees for concussion-related neurological diseases such as dementia, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, right, or CTE. While this settlement seemed like a victory to some black players, black players quickly found out that it would be harder to access these funds because the NFL required that cognitive tests used be adjusted for race, i.e. race normating. Okay? With this in mind, Henry and Davenport, as I mentioned earlier, quietly filed a lawsuit against the NFL in the fall of 2020. Quote, black former players are automatically assumed through a statistical manipulation called race norming to have started with worse cognitive functioning than white former players. As a result, if a black former player and a white former player receive the exact same raw scores on a battery of tests designed to measure their current cognitive functioning, the black player is presumed to have suffered less impairment, and he is therefore less likely to qualify for compensation, their lawsuit contended. Right? Now, I'm going to pause here a second and just say this. I want to make sure that y'all are following me on this, right? The NFL decided in 2021 to stop using this practice. So the June announcement was rightly met with shock that the practice had even been in use. But for those for those who are attuned to the actions, such as the writer of this article, and strategies of the most profitable and popular professional sport league in the United States, the news wasn't much of a surprise. It is just the latest example on the laundry list of the NFL's anti-black, racist, and discriminatory practices over the past decades. For the NFL, race norming depends on the belief, okay? It depends on the belief that race is a binary, biological concept, and therefore that differences in black bodies and minds are not only existent, but quantifiable. But they're wrong on all accounts, according to the author, right? Race norming is an inherently anti-black form of scientific racism that is evidence of slavery's afterlife. Now, one of the authors of this piece, and I'm going to put this piece back up and give him due credit, she calls herself a black feminist and anthropologist, one who specializes in sport in Canada, and the other in medicine and public health, who is Carter, interested in the social and lived experience of blackness in the United States. She said they question how one's interactions with the social world are influenced by one's racialized experiences. The ways that, for instance, the way that black football players navigate their time as current and former NFL athletes point to the continued social inequities that plague the league beyond claims of anti-black racism. Now, this is the same league whose cheerleaders accused it of gender discrimination. A league where only one player on an active roster has felt comfortable disclosing their sexuality as a gay man. A league where only 3 of 32 head coaches are black, and where some teams maintain racist cultures that you can see in their mascots. And a league where black athletes account for more than 70% of the labor force on the gridiron. When we consider the racial demographics of this situation alongside the plantation metaphors that riddle play in the NFL, then the injuries that athletes sustain, especially concussions and their side effects, can be classified in the words of Saidiya Hartman as the afterlife of slavery, right? Really, really interesting stuff. Really just hits home sometimes, right? And these injuries, vis-a-vis, concussions and subsequent neurological disorders, are just one of the ways that anti-blackness will continue to impact athletes long after they retire and are no longer affiliated with their professional teams. Often these athletes' lives are fundamentally changed by their experience with the sport, for instance, of football. In his investigation of the spectacle and business of hockey, scholar Nathan Coleman Lamb writes of the structural importance of injury, pain, and violence to a team spectator sport. And as despicable a notion as this is, it's true. These are woven into the fabric of football largely for this reason. Average NFL careers across all playing positions are only 2.66 years long. Thus, the tag "not for long" from sociologist Robert Turner's ethnography of NFL athletes rings true as ever, right? Given the capitalistic impulse of the league, these athletes are cared for just enough to protect the investment that has been made in their labor. NFL teams spent over $500 million on injuries in 2019. But the question becomes, whose bodies, injuries, and health matter most, right, to the league? By requiring race normating to determine neurocognitive impairments in former players, the NFL acted as a racialized organization as defined by sociologist Victor Ray, legitimizing the unequal distribution of resources to the majority of their players. Not only did this practice extend the NFL's participation in anti-black practices, it also allowed the league to live up to its capitalist ideals. By 2015, the agreement in the settlement had been updated to nearly $1 billion available for settlement claims funded by the NFL. Even with the NFL's overwhelming financial prominence, race normating was one way the league could more closely moderate who was eligible for a settlement. Yet, despite its contemporary uses, race normating can be traced back to plantation slavery, eugenics efforts globally, and a long history of racial science used to justify the belief in inferior racial groups. These misguided scientific endeavors are rooted in an ideal that black people's bodies are inherently different from white people's bodies. There's a scholar by the name of Lucia Trimble, Lundy Braun, and Dorothy Roberts, and they have outlined that race normating, also called, again, race correction and ethnic adjustment, and more broadly, race-based medicine, are not new phenomenons, right? Such as statistical practice has been used in medical specialties like pulmonology, neuropsychology, obstetrics, as we showed, urology, nephrology. Braun's work reveals that Thomas Jefferson's discovery of differences in pulmonary function between black enslaved people and white people, rooted in his beliefs that black enslaved people had lower lung capacity than whites. Now, this fact, so-called fact, spread and then directly impacted the development of race correction and spirometers, an apparatus still used to measure respiratory disease today. In nephrology, EGFR, another race norm test, is the gold standard, believe it or not, for measuring kidney function. This test measures levels of creatine and adjusts for gender, age, and race. In 1999, a study developed a statistical prediction equation for EGFR based on race because scientists determined that black people's muscle mass, on average, was higher than white people's, which they argued leads to higher kidney function. This deduction is not only flawed because race is not biological, nor is it genetically linked, but also because the muscle mass of living humans simply cannot be measured feasibly in clinics, according to nephrologists Wamaka D. and Nanya, right? So despite calls from the nation's leading experts to end its use, the test continues to persist. Race norming practices in lung and kidney function mirror the NFL's use of cognitive impairments. The impacts of these anti-black practices with medicine are not just dire because of potential financial compensation, but because they are real consequences on black people's health and well-being in this country. Outside of these examples and off the gridiron, these findings about race normating are reminiscent of studies that show bias in pain treatment based on assumptions of biological differences between white and black patients, unequal COVID-19 treatment and outcomes for black patients, the ongoing black maternal health crisis as black women face higher rates of pregnancy-related deaths, the misdiagnosis of diseases like ALS in black patients, and countless other ways that racialized and gendered bias influence the care of historically marginalized groups, right? This is interesting stuff, y'all. This is interesting stuff. And I'm going to continue to talk about this, but I just want to hear a little bit because this makes me feel like I want to hear this, and I don't know if I can locate it. I'm gonna have it played for you all because I just talk about this. This is something that I like talking about. But he brings me back to reality every time I hear him give this speech, and I can't find it. Let me just go a little bit closer, y'all. I'm sorry. Anyway, I'm going to show y'all a little bit of. I'm just going to take a quick break and be right back. I love John Lewis, and I can't believe he's gone, but I'll be right back.
I have the pleasure to present to this great audience young John Lewis, National Chairman, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Brother John Lewis.
Philosophy is very simple. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble.
What about the 3 young men, SNCC Field Secretary in Americus, Georgia, who faced the death penalty for engaging in peaceful protest? As it stands now, the voting section of this bill will not help the thousands of white people who want to vote. It will not help the citizens of Mississippi, of Alabama, and Georgia who are qualified to vote for lack of 6th grade education. One man, one vote is the African cry. It is ours too. It must be ours. We must have legislation that will protect the Mississippi sharecropper, who is put off of his farm.
I ain't scared of you motherfuckers.
Either way, I don't give a damn what you think you are entitled to.
You are listening to Conscious Fever, hosted by Carl Price.
All right, welcome back to Conscious Fever here on ICE Entertainment Television and Conscious Fever Radio. We're talking about race normating tonight. We're talking about how race is used, we're reminded because of what the NFL did. The NFL just sort of came around and said, we've screwed this up for many, many years. And if y'all want to think about race normating and how we have witnessed it for many, many years, think about the whole black quarterback phenomenon, right? We see a lot of black. You turn the TV on now, and even tonight, there. I don't know who's playing. I think it's just it might be Green. I'm not sure who's playing tonight, but if the 2 teams that are playing, they probably have a primary quarterback who is black or a secondary quarterback who is black, right, on their team. But go back to the 70s, and this was not the case. During the case of Joe Namath days and Johnny Unitas, this was not the case. And one of the reasons it was not the case because this ideal of race normating sort of believed that blacks did not have the cognitive functioning to read defenses and different things like that. And that's why you have what you have, just in terms of this race normating stuff. But that's an example of the practice. And if you remember just turning the TV on, the Doug Williams of the days and different things like that, everybody was surprised about that. 1, because they had never seen it. And 2, because the NFL has suppressed it for so long following this race normating ideal that the cognitive function of a black athlete was not the same as a white athlete. And because of that, that is the reason in the 70s and the 60s we didn't see a host of black quarterbacks. We saw them in high school quarterbacking. We saw them at some of the HBCU colleges quarterbacking. We saw them even at some of the SEC schools, the Big 12 schools, the Big 10 schools. We saw them on the roster, but we never saw them out front. That was the reason why. Many of you all didn't know that. But just continuing on with this discussion about this before I get out of here. Recently, just so you know, scientists announced an effort to study the connections between the NFL and, for instance, ALS. ALS, the illness commonly referred to as Lou Gehrig's disease, after the famous Yankee Football Hall of Famer, after Lou Gehrig, who played for the Yankees. But as at the point that this article was presented, or this information was presented, 13 former NFL players have come forward with an ALS diagnosis. And this is in a league where 70% of the players are black and nearly 73% non-white. Only 2 black men with ALS have come forward, while the other 11 persons with ALS are white. Now, these lopsided ratios suggest the ways that the environment, bias, structural inequities, and racial capitalism in slavery's multiple afterlives impact medical diagnosis and care. Not simply who gets a settlement from the NFL, right? Those who submitted claims for this concussion-related settlement, for instance, are navigating the NFL's anti-black afterlife. Right? Concussions are a major component of this, given they are underreported during play and so little is known about their long-term effects in living former players. Right? So through this system, as Hortense Spiller suggests, the bodies of these black players are reduced from their full humanity to merely flesh. Right? It says we must continue to examine anti-blackness in its full extent in order to keep black bodies from harm, injury, and most importantly, a premature death as we continue to live in slavery's afterlife. Now, I told y'all earlier that was an article that was written by Felicia Cineas. She calls it Race Normating and the Long Legacy of Medical Racism Explained. The NFL recently announced it would end the practice, but race normating is still used across the medical field. Interesting stuff, y'all. Very, 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 very interesting stuff. And I bet a lot of y'all didn't know that. Many of y'all may have seen the 60 Minutes report with the NFL player where they talked about race normating and different things like that. And a lot of people really didn't understand what he was talking about. And a lot of people for the first time had heard that concept of race normating for the first time. But here's what's scary about what we heard on that 60 Minutes report. If you didn't see that 60 Minutes report, I think there's a channel called Paramount TV. Go back and watch that. It will blow you away. A couple of takeaways, right? The first takeaway is that the application of this so-called concept of racial adjustment, the thought that it still existed in 2021, you would think that it didn't now that you're seeing so many black quarterbacks, right? But look for the connection as to why there's not so many black coaches, right? Because the measurement of this race normating, it's just not for athletes as well, you know? And the ideal that the NFL has existed for so long and has been populated, you know, their labor force, as the article indicated, is mostly black. The ideal of all of that and still applying this ideal of racial adjustment is just crazy, right? I mean, it's mind-boggling. But the other takeaway is the fact that the NFL didn't make this up. This came from doctors. So the next time you go see your doctor, just, you know, give it some thought. Because I would tell you, I mean, many of y'all know that I had a stage 4 diagnosis of stage 4 cancer diagnosis in 2010. And trust me, I have wondered many, many times as to whether I had been misdiagnosed. I wondered about that. You know, because one of the other things that's not talked about a lot that race normating or the net effect of race normating is the ideal that sometimes you're overdiagnosed, right? I mean, sometimes they tell you got it and you really don't. So it's really interesting stuff, and it's really an ideal to just think about how, you know, when we have an opportunity to think about this ideal of going to the doctor, you probably never thought that listening to a story about the NFL would help you the next time you go to a doctor, right? Because it really would. It really would. Just the thought that doctors are a lot more reluctant to give pain medication to black patients. And then you wonder why we have an opioid epidemic, right, in this country, in this state, in this city, in this region. You wonder why we have that, and most of the people who are affected are Caucasians, right? Right? Because you come in as a Caucasian to a doctor, or a traditionally taught doctor, I'll say, not all doctors, but you go into that doctor's office and you say, look, listen, I'm having this pain. Okay, you're having pain. You come in there as black and you say that you're having pain, you may not get those pills. And maybe, I'm not saying that it is because I'm not a scientist in that area, but maybe that's the reason why we have so many Caucasians addicted to opioids and fentanyl and all of these drugs, all of this pain medication. And the numbers were not so high for black people. Maybe it's because the doctors wasn't giving it to black people. So I say that because I also find it extremely strange, y'all, that in the legal field, there was prosecution of drug dealers, individuals who sold the drug, right, to a victim who later died. Those individuals were subject to prosecution, right? And now that you understand this ideal about race normating, it's just not the drug dealers. It's a little bit of everybody. And I'm not talking about the NFL, but it's a little bit of everybody. It's just a system. The other takeaway from what I'm talking about tonight is this, and I really want y'all to remember this. I really want y'all to hold on to this, and don't ever forget this. Is where else does this exist? Where else in our society today is there practices that directly impact us, impact our lives, impact our health? And every day somebody comes into an office or a setting or a medical complex and they know it's out there and they just continue to allow it to continue to exist. Right? It's really crazy stuff. But I wonder, where else is this practice taking place? Right? Last takeaway from this should be this, y'all. And I'm not always, I'm a little bit anti when it comes to doing anything with my body, right? I talked about it last week on this show. I'm not really a person that will get tattoos or anything like that because I don't believe in altering my body. I believe my body is God's work, and it should continue to remain the way God intended it to remain. So I'm not a big fan of a whole lot of tattoos and marks on my body and different things like that. If there are scars on my body, they're probably hood or ghetto scars. If they're or something like that. I do have a fraternity brand because I was ignorant and just didn't know any better. I wasn't as close to God as I am now, or to my Christian beliefs as I am now. But the interesting thing is that this last takeaway is the fact that we really have to speak up when we're in a doctor's office, right? We really have to speak up. Because if you think that this ideal of race normating is still being practiced today, and it is in smaller communities. Y'all know that what I'm talking about tonight only applies to certain communities. It doesn't really apply. Like there was a picture here, and I think the picture is right there now. In this picture, there's a white doctor giving in 1939 a South Carolina family, a mother and her children, some malaria medicine, medication, right? But the whole ideal that in smaller communities that this is still practiced, right? It is still practiced. You go in and you say, hey, listen, I'm in pain. And they say, oh, well, we can't give you that. We can only give you pain medication at a certain time. Well, what you didn't know, and this is something that I have since learned from my battle with stage 4 cancer, right, was that they had a timetable at the hospital during my chemo when I was in ICU as to when they could administer the medicine. I don't know if many of you all know, but and when I say timetable, I don't really mean, timetable is not really the best word to use, but there was a schedule as to when I could get the pain medicine. Now, I wasn't in a lot of pain, but sometimes when I was in pain, I did request the medicine. But the interesting thing is that I found out that they had a different schedule for the administering of pain medicine for the black patients as they did for the white patients. Right, but the way they justified it was that, okay, well, this patient may be white, but this patient is older. This patient may be white, but this patient is more sick, right? But the reality was that white patient had a different schedule than the black patient did, and that's why the pain medicine wasn't distributed as much as it normally should have been. So anyway, I hope y'all have enjoyed that. I've had just a little bit, but it's interesting stuff. And this whole ideal of the NFL and the fact that the NFL had this as a practice. And I want to make sure y'all understand before I get off the air that this ideal of the practice, the way they practiced it, was very, very interesting, right? Because the NFL makes a lot of money, but when it comes to paying out almost $1 billion for all these people that you have sent out on this field, you pay them some money, i.e. enticement, to go out on this field, rack it up, knock each other around and hurt each other, and have all these concussions. And there are some long-term effects. For every concussion, there's some long-term effects. That they resisted paying them by saying, we're going to measure. By measuring your brain, we're going to measure what effect all of that head knocking and beating. And you got to understand that the people are asking for the concussion money now are players that were playing when the helmets were not as protective as they are now, right? It's just like the boxers back in the day, right? There were when they sparred, they had different headsets that they wore. They have different headsets, in terms of what they were today than they did back then. But in any case, this whole ideal that the NFL, in light of everything that you just heard tonight, and in light of the racial norm, that they will go to the settlement table in a courtroom and say, we'll give you the money, but we're going to determine who's eligible, right? And whether you're eligible is going to depend on how much impact the NFL has had on your cognitive functioning. But if you're a black player, your cognitive functioning is way down here, according to this race normating concept. And if you're a white player, the cognitive function is this far up. If now as a white player with this cognitive function this far up, you're down to here, you don't get some money, right? But think about that. Look at where my hands are, right? That the white cognitive function is still not as low as what they have determined to be the highest black cognitive function. So the black players don't get any money. It's bullshit. That's crazy. But that's the NFL. So next time you watch an NFL game, you watch, for instance, Lamar Jackson running around the field and different things like that, and being entertained by that, just keep in mind, it is the NFL. Right? NFL. Some have referred to the NFL. I can't say the word on here, but I'll spell it NIGGAS for laughs. Right? All right, y'all. Listen, I want to say, as I always do, thank you for joining me tonight here on Conscious Fever, here on Ice Entertainment Television, Conscious Fever Radio. If you're not listening to us in all of those places, I appreciate that you would. Interesting stuff tonight. I hope y'all have learned something tonight. I didn't see any comments tonight because something's going on with Facebook or Meta. I'm not sure what they're going to be called now. I almost said something, but I'm not. But I'm not going to say that. I am not going to say it. But I am going to get out of here. I'm going to tell you that tonight, where is that transition? I'm going to tell you that tonight, this is what we talked about. Check it out.
I ain't scared of you motherfuckers.
Either way, I don't give a damn what you think you are entitled to.
You are listening to Conscious Fever, hosted by Carl Price.
And that's what we were talking about tonight. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm done. It's 10 o'clock here on the East Coast. I'll be back next week. I don't know who's going to be here with me. I don't know if I'm going to be here by myself. But in any case, I will be back next week. I have had a request. I've got to play a couple of promos before I get out of here, and I hope y'all can appreciate that and just bear with me. And after those promos, I'm going to come back and end this show.
I get enough of you. Bright sneakers on, getting ready for a flashback. Time keeps moving on, looking at you, feeling like I could never get enough of you. And I could never get enough of you. I could never get enough of you.
I don't want them, no, get them all off me. Say down for hell, she'll cause me. 4 cars deep, we'll come through on a late night. Chicken spot, wings and fries, we call that a day night. Lights on, so out, I don't have no stage right. Knew that I was built for this forever, ever.
You are listening to Conscious Fever, hosted by Carl Price.
We ride bands, 10 times 10, all my friends, this for real.
And we are back with more Conscious Fever, hosted by Carl Price, Esquire.
Alicia, what do you do?
I'm an inbound marketing strategist for colleges and universities.
Okay, listen, remember to check us out on Twitter and YouTube, as well as the Conscious Fever page on Facebook. I've got to get out of here. I'm going to go with an old credit to get us out because many people have requested this. So again, listen, if you're trick-or-treating on Sunday, and I know adults don't trick-or-treat, you just take your kids out, your grandkids out, and different things like that. I get that. Listen, but I know why adults trick-or-treat, right? Adults trick-or-treat for one reason, because they want to put on a lot of those costumes. And I will tell you that the most popular costume this year, apparently, is, for women, is Batgirl. So look out for that. Listen, I'm Carl Price. This has been Conscious Fever here on Ice Entertainment Television, Conscious Fever Radio. I'll see you next week.
You are listening to Conscious Fever, hosted by Carl Price.
I was born by the river in a little tent. Like the river I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh yes it will. It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die. 'Cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh yes it is.
couldn't last for long. But now I think I'm able, Father, to carry on. And it's been a long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes it is, yes it is, yes it is. Said I know that a change is gonna come one day. I know a change